Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar. As you all are entering into the space, feel free to pull up that chat box and type in maybe where you're tuning in from or a church that you're a part of, one thing you hope to learn. And as people are coming in, you can get settled in. Hi, Michelle. It looks like a few folks so far are hopping on from Calvary. We've got someone from Center Church hopping on. So again, as people are joining the webinar, we're just encouraging folks to open up that chat box and share what church you're a part of, that you're joining in from, maybe where you're tuning in from. I know that we have a few folks registered that are out of state, and maybe one thing you hope to learn during this webinar today. We'll get started momentarily. Folks tuning in from Lewistown, from Calvary. Wow, lots of people posting. Wonderful. We got people from Center Church tuning in, Assemblies of God in State College. Folks from Harvest Fields, Our Lady Victory, State College Alliance Church. We had about 20 or so different churches represented on our registration list. So we're really excited that people are joining from all around the region. We've also had some people that joined in as well from different states. So yeah, lots of people registered for this. So we're excited that you're joining. We had around 150 people register for the webinar tonight. There are also some folks that weren't able to attend, and so we're going to be recording this session, a portion of it, so that we can send that out later on. Looks like we have people on from Unity, people from Center Church again, Park Hill Baptist Church. Oh, we've got one from New Jersey, Living Word Reformed Church from North Haledon, New Jersey. Hopefully I pronounced that right, Marlo. Thanks for joining. We've got Garrett White with Calvary, but he's tuning in from Texas tonight. State College Alliance. Lots of folks tuning in from lots of different places. Resurrection OPC. All right. Well, we're just gonna wait a few more minutes for a few more folks to join, and then we're officially gonna get started. We've got folks from Cedar Heights Church, Oakwood Presbyterian and State College. People sharing, we hope to learn what we can do to help. Yeah, I think that's resonating with a lot of people right now. Sharing what you want to learn. Maybe post that in the chat if you haven't yet. What's something that you're hoping to take away from this webinar today? All right, so let's go ahead and get started with our time this evening. Thank you so much for tuning in to Understanding Racism 101. This is actually a program that is coming out of a ministry that was originally started between Calvary and Unity Church in State College, Pennsylvania. I want to hand it over to Curtis Price in a moment. He's actually the leader of that ministry, and so he's going to share a little bit more about that ministry, start us off in prayer for our time, and get us going that way. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Curtis.
Thank you, Katie. So if you can advance the slide for me, great. So the Racial Unity Network, as Katie explained, we've been a ministry that I would say within the last 4 years has been forming and shaping. We are a Christ-centered cross-denominational ministry in Central Pennsylvania. So a lot of the churches that are involved with Run are from the State College, Pennsylvania area, Center County area, part of the city church structure that is in the city. And we work to bring about racial justice and reconciliation to the church. So we start with ourselves. We're looking to defeat the sin of racism within the church, within ourselves, and then reach out into the community. At the end of our webinar, we're going to provide a few more facts and information about RUN, and also ways that you can connect to RUN if you're interested in being a part of the group, or figure out exactly how you can, how we can help you in your own space with some of your needs if you sense this really spirit-led urge to take on the sins of racism, dismantling systemic racism that's around us, helping people to be reconciled, things like that. So I'll start us off in our time of prayer. And I'm going to be praying Martin Luther King's prayer for the church. So if you would, bow your heads with me and let's look to the Lord in prayer. Lord, we thank you for your church founded upon your word that challenges us to do more than sing and pray, but to go out and work as though the very answer to our prayers depended on us and not upon you. Help us to realize that humanity was created to shine like the stars and live on through all eternity. Keep us, Lord, we pray, in perfect peace. Help us to walk together, pray together, sing together, and live together until that day when all God's children, black, white, red, brown, and yellow, will rejoice in one common band of humanity. In the reign of our Lord and of our God, we pray these things. Amen.
Thanks, Curtis. I appreciate that for starting off that time for us. So I want to share a few housekeeping things and logistics as we get started with the webinar. The first thing is that, again, this is a webinar format, so this screen will be shared the whole time, but you, for those of you who are new to Zoom, you can actually move around the video boxes of me and Curtis and JoAnn so that you can see the slides better. So if you're having trouble seeing the slides, you can just scroll up to the top of your screen right now under view options, and you can click on that, and then it'll say Zoom ratio underneath, and you can play with that a little bit to make sure that you can see the full slides and also us as well. So I just want to give that housekeeping thing to help your experience be a little bit better, to make sure that you're seeing all the information on the slides. The other thing, again, that I want to mention is that we're going to record the content portion of this session. And we're gonna stop recording right before we get to the Q&A section. So we'll have time for Q&A at the end, but for this first portion, we're going to go through just the content and record that so that we can post it. Eric is the person that's doing our background text. So Eric, if you wanna start the recording, we can get that going. All right, so thanks again for joining this Understanding Racism 101 webinar through the Racial Unity Network. One thing that I do want to share as we get into this is just the approach that we're taking as we enter into these conversations about racial injustice and about racism. We're approaching everything that we do with the Racial Unity Network from a Christian, Christ-centered perspective. The Bible has a lot to say, and God has a lot to say about these issues. And even though they might be new for some people to talk about, these issues have been around a long time, and they aren't very new to a lot of people as well. But as we look through what God says about racial justice and about showing up for people, I think that there are a lot of really key themes that God talks about on a consistent basis, and that he hopes for his church and for his people. The first theme is that back from Genesis, right, God created all people in his image. And that's consistently gone back to in the Bible. And I think it helps us consider the dignity and humanity of every other person that we interact with. There's also a lot of messages, Mark included, around loving your neighbor as yourself, right? To really go beyond sort of our own personal self-interest and put ourselves in the shoes of others and really go beyond ourselves to love other people that may not be similar to us. The last piece that I want to share is these themes around justice and standing up for the oppressed and showing up for the oppressed. And that's a consistent theme, not just in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament as well. And we're hoping to do a lot more sessions in the future. Again, Racial Unity Network has been around for a few years in some form, but we just recently sort of became more of a concrete group. And so we're just starting to form groups. But we're hoping to do more sessions around these topics and to dive deeper into how God sees these issues and really diving into the Bible and what God is saying scripturally about these topics. And so these are just some of the themes that I think that we're all pretty familiar with as Christians about how we approach this work and starting to have these conversations. And one thing I do want to share is around what we're actually going to be able to cover today. So racism and racial injustice is a big topic, and it goes pretty deep. It has pretty deep roots. And so we can't cover everything today. We're hoping to cover a few definitions that people may have been hearing. This is really an introductory session, and that's what it's designed for, but we're hoping everybody, wherever you start with and wherever you end with today, that you can have a few key takeaways that are helpful for you. But we also want to really start to demonstrate to people and take a look at how racism plays out sort of on the individual level, so that person to person sort of everyday level, but also the systems that we're a part of, it plays out in a lot of other systems. And so JoAnn in a little bit is going to share more about that. And then lastly, we want to end with a few initial steps that we can be taking. Really what our hope, and if we do a good job with this, what we're hoping is that you'll actually leave with more questions than you came with. And that's our hope, because as you start to dive into these things, it naturally brings up more questions. And so that's what we're hoping to take away. The other piece as we start to engage in these conversations, and if you want to go to the next slide, JoAnn, you can, is that, when we take this idea of our values as Christians and our values as people, to treat other people with dignity, to love our neighbors as ourselves, and when that's such a strong value for us, and then we start to learn about the actual ways that racism and injustice play out on a daily basis, especially for white people, that can create a lot of dissonance. And so I do want to address that as we start to have these conversations, that there might be different emotions that come up for people, and that's a pretty normal reaction. And again, the majority of people that have tuned into this webinar are people that identify as white. And it's also a predominantly white community and church community that we're speaking with. And so I do want to just go over some of these things, because I think that's helpful to give a frame, because unfortunately, when we have these emotions that come up that we're wrestling with, when there's that dissonance that's created, the temptation is to sort of just give up and be silent. And that's the last thing we need to be doing. That's the last thing that God wants us to do. He wants us to engage. And so some of the things that really come up are around fear, right? Fear that we might find out that some of our behaviors have really hurt people, that our behaviors might be considered racist, right? At some times, and we didn't even realize it. Fear that, fear of change, like of what that looks like and what that means. There's a lot of fears that come up for people around these topics. Also, a lot of shame and guilt can come up, thinking, oh my gosh, I'm a horrible person, right? Or feeling incredibly bad for behaviors we may have engaged in that we didn't, again, really mean to cause harm with in the past, and how that's played out and actually impacted people. People can tend to get defensive, right, or sort of deny. And I think, again, defensive is a normal emotion, but it's when it gets to the point of wanting to shut down or not wanting to be able to engage that it can get in the way and be a barrier. Also trying to absolve ourselves, you know, when we found out that we've done something wrong or been hurtful in some way, trying to sort of explain that or say like, no, we didn't mean to do that. And then it's, you know, it's us trying to sort of repair and say, no, I'm an okay person. I'm an okay person. Another piece of this is around, you know, learning and saying, oh my gosh, I need to learn so much more. I'm going to go find a person of color to teach me everything so that I don't step in it anymore, right? And that can be a natural sort of reaction or wanting to do that. And one thing I'll just say to that is that, especially if we've hurt somebody directly, or if you're hoping to be educated by a person of color, in particular, somebody who's Black, that cannot be helpful. That's actually not very helpful in some ways. And so one thing I do want to acknowledge about tonight and with our group is that, you know, myself and JoAnn, we're both white women, you know, and we think it's really important that white people are teaching other white people about racism and about these things, because when we put it on people of color and Black people to educate us about our own ways that we've been hurtful and about racism, that's putting a lot of emotional labor and burden on people. And so we just want to be mindful of that. At the same time, we want to learn from Black voices, right? And from other people of color that have committed their life to this. And so a little bit later in the session, we'll talk a little bit more about how to navigate some of that. Another piece, again, that I want to talk about is that as all these things build up and as they come up, that temptation can at times be to shut down or to say like, I'm saying the wrong thing, I keep getting this wrong, or I'm getting this feedback, I'm just going to give up, I'm just going to be silent, right? And it might, again, you might be sort of wondering like, what is all this stuff? Like, what's the point of doing these things, right? But I do want to give you a few tips as you're working through this and through this journey that we found helpful ourselves in our group. And the first is to embrace discomfort, right? Like things are going to get uncomfortable, but that's okay. I think as Christians, we're sort of primed to continuously reflect on how we're engaging in our lives, on areas that we may want to improve on how we're impacting other people, on our relationships with God. And so that's a continuous space that we're often going to God to reflect and to have him reveal things to us. And so I think, you know, the point of this is not to say that discomfort is bad, but to use that as a learning tool to say, wow, there's a lot coming up for me right now. I'm going to sit with that and pause and sort of work through it. Because if you feel those things coming up and then you push away, then you're going to continue to feel those same things and you aren't going to actually be able to make that progress and work through it. And so embracing that discomfort, these things will come up. Even for me, I have done all those things. And I've been doing this for a little bit of time. And sometimes I still feel these things, right? Whenever I accidentally, like unintentionally hurt or offend somebody, like I just feel so much shame, and it rises up my neck and like into my cheeks, and they get really hot, and I just want to crawl under a rock and just be done and like really be done with it, you know, and not like do this anymore. And again, that's the last thing that we want to do. And then the other piece is humility, right? Coming to this, JoAnn and I both don't think that we're experts. We've been trying to do this work. We feel like we're along the journey just like everyone else. And the idea, and what I think is helpful, this quote by Brene Brown, when she's talking about doing this work, she said, I'm here to get it right and not to be right. And so as you're going through this, right, just sort of reminding yourself, okay, I'm here to get it right, not to be right. And so I think that helps us position ourselves as we move forward. And I want to share a quote by Austin Channing Brown, because I think that helps really center us back to the purpose of this work and what the point is, because you might be seeing all these things and like, why do I want to do this, right? Like, what am I really getting into? But Austin Channing Brown is a speaker and Christian woman and activist, and she has this really great quote. She says, our only chance at dismantling racial injustice is being more curious about its origins than we are worried about our comfort. It's not a comfortable conversation for any of us. It's risky and messy. It is haunting work to recall the sins of our past. But is this not the work that we've been called to anyway? Is this not the work of the Holy Spirit to illuminate truth and inspire transformation? It's haunting, but it's also holy. And so with that, I want to hand it over to JoAnn Foley-DeFiore. She is one of the team members on our Equipping the Church community team, and we're very excited to have her be a part of that team. And what she's going to do is that for the bulk of this time, she's going to share a little bit about that individual and sort of institutional racism and how it plays out. She's a really great person to speak on this. She's been doing this work for a few decades at this point. She's also worked on a few committees to do this work in her own department. And in addition to that, she's married with 2 awesome kids. So that's always a great thing. And she's been a member of Calvary Church since 2010. So with that, if you brought some pen and paper, I'd encourage you to pull it out because she has lots of good things that she's going to teach us about. And I'm going to hand it over to you, JoAnn.
Thanks so much, Katie. And thanks for coming, everybody who's here today. It's a little bit difficult to be teaching you guys on Zoom and teaching this topic to you on Zoom, because normally we'd be together in a classroom. We would have maybe a whole semester, maybe more than a semester together to really dive deep into this topic. I would see you, I would get to know you, you would share some personal stories, and you would get to know me. And so we would build rapport and trust over the semester. We don't have that today, but I would like to share one thing about myself, which is that I first learned about white privilege and racism as a topic of study as an undergraduate in 1988, so that tells you how old I am, as a sociology major. And in 1988 is when the article called White Privilege came out, even though that concept existed long before that. And I read it as a junior in college, and I just absorbed it. And it really convicted me when I realized that I could go shopping without worrying about being followed or harassed, or I could watch TV or the news or any other curriculum and see my race represented fairly and evenly. This was eye-opening back in 1988 to me. 1988, though, was also a year of a lot of personal troubles for me, and that my very best friend, childhood friend, was killed in the Pan Am bombing of 1988, the plane crash bombing. And it's so interesting to me that even though I was having a lot of personal troubles and private issues that year, I was able to look at this article and really reflect on the fact that I still had a lot of white privilege. So one thing about white privilege is that it's a lot of unearned advantages that we have, and we're gonna talk about that later. So that was 32 years ago, and I've been studying this and teaching this since that time, but even with all of that, you know, knowledge in quotes and studying and experience, I still was thrown off guard when coronavirus hit and COVID-19, we were asked to wear masks. I was expecting health disparities. I knew that was coming. I knew that African Americans were going to be disproportionately disadvantaged with this illness. But what I wasn't prepared for was when one of my African American students told me over a Zoom conference call that he was really, really concerned about wearing a mask in public. He was worried about how he would be perceived, about how he would be judged, and he was also very fearful for his own life and safety. So even after all these years, I was still taken off guard about another area of white privilege. I didn't have to worry about that. I never even thought about it until he pointed it out. So I'm sharing that story to tell you that I have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do. So let's get started with our topic for today. We're here today because of the outpouring of people's interest in race and racism after George Floyd was murdered. And George Floyd was just the tip of the iceberg. He's just the tip of the iceberg of all of the Black lives lost. And it feels a little bit these days like we're cramming for an exam, that we are seeing a lot of things on social media, a lot of things. We're watching YouTube videos and TED Talks. And we know in the teaching world that when you cram for an exam, you often don't retain the information. So with the Run Network, we want to have these teachings because we want you to remember. We want you to study and learn and digest the concepts so you can remember. So our teaching goal for today is to understand that racism and white privilege are really one system. And we want to understand how racism and white privilege, the origins of that, as Austin Channing Brown said, and how they work together to systematically privilege one group of people, white people in general, and oppress another group of people. And we hope to illustrate how we've ended up with so many Black lives lost. So my learning objectives for you, we hope that at the end of this seminar, seminar, we hope that you can be empowered with definitions and key concepts about systemic racism and white privilege. We hope that you can identify where you can take action. And very importantly, we hope that you know how to pray against the specific aspects of systemic racism. So let's start with this system. It's a little bit more complicated than this picture here, but we're gonna start with the basics. So this system of racism and white privilege operates at least two levels, the two levels that we're gonna cover today. There's the individual level, and that's the level of our attitudes and our actions. And then there's the institutional level, and that's the level of systems and policies. Systems like our education system or the healthcare system or the criminal justice system, policies like laws or policies that maybe universities have. So that's at the institutional level. And this whole system, the two levels reinforce each other. So as individuals change, they can change institutions. As institutions change, they can change the individual. What has happened historically and has continued today is that this system works in such a way that it oppresses Black people and other peoples of color with a lack of power, and simultaneously it advantages white people with power and privilege. So let's first start with a definition of the white privilege part of the system. So the white privilege part, we refer to it as this backpack because in the article that was written about it in 1988, she refers to it as a knapsack. White privilege is the unearned rights, advantages, and privileges that are accrued to white people because of this system. And also white privilege is meant to be invisible. So if you've never noticed it before as a white person, it's because you weren't meant to notice it as a white person. In this next slide, I'm just going to show you some examples of it because I think that's the best way to illustrate the concept. And I'm not going to talk, I'm just going to let you read them and maybe jot down wherever you're taking notes, the ones that resonate the most with you, that you identify with. So the one that stands out most for me as a mom is that I've never had to educate my children to be aware of systemic racism for their own physical protection. That's a burden that Black moms have had to have and other people of color have had to have as parents. But as a white woman, I've had the privilege of not having to teach my children about that. The other one that stands out to me is that I'm never asked to speak for all the people of my racial ethnic group. My actions and my words at a meeting at work, for example, or a meeting of moms, for example, is never used as a reflection of my entire racial ethnic group. So this is just the very surface definition of white privilege, but just think about some of these examples in your own life. Okay, we're going to stick at the individual level still here. So how does racism and white privilege look at the individual level? So first of all, the individual level includes discrimination. Discrimination is negative treatment and action towards people based on their race. These are individual actions, such as following somebody around Walmart, assuming that they're going to steal something, or calling someone the N-word. This is what we call individual discrimination. It can also take the form of microaggressions, and these are brief, kind of daily, intentional or unintentional actions or words that can negatively slight people of color or Black people. The second kind of individual racism is called, well, we call it a couple different things. So let me give you all of the names: prejudice, stereotyping, bias, and bigotry. So I'll just define each one of them. Prejudice are those negative attitudes and feelings. It's an attitude and a feeling. They kind of go together towards individuals based on solely their membership in a racial group. Stereotyping are these mistaken generalizations that we make about people in a particular racial ethnic group. And then finally, bigotry is an extreme version of prejudice that borders on hatred. So it's still prejudice, but it's an extreme version. And so a lot of these show up as our biases. These are biases that we have about people based on their racial ethnic group and other characteristics. But if you look at this image here, you can see that we have three different individuals with three different racial ethnic groups represented, or at least 2 to 3. But they're also dressed differently. And when you look at this image, you might be able to notice where you have a different feeling or different attitude based on skin color, based on how they're dressed, based on how their hair is done. And these are the types of things that we want to uproot in our own lives. Okay, so we just quickly covered the individual level racism. And I know that was really fast, but we're going to talk about the institutional level racism as well, because that is an important piece that keeps this whole system in place. So let's first define what it is. So institutional racism and white privilege. This is a system that was created and is actually operating. People say the system's broken, but the truth is that it was created to operate in this way, to privilege certain people over others. And so what it refers to are discriminatory rules, policies, practices that are within organizations or within institutions. So it's not individuals anymore. These are rules and regulations that are within institutions. And what happens is these rules and regulations result in unequal access to the goods of society, the economic goods, the services, and the opportunities, educational or economic opportunities or otherwise. Unequal access to those components based on race. This system of institutional racism and white privilege is also deeply rooted in the history of our country. 400 plus years old, this system has been in place. It's also part of our cultural beliefs and ideologies. And it's reinforced over time by all these different institutions, the healthcare institution, educational institution. It continues to be reinforced and recreated by our culture over time. So let's look at some examples. I always think that the best way to learn something is by looking at some concrete real life examples to show how systemic racism and systemic white privilege operates. So let's look at the first one, which is redlining. And redlining was actually an outcome of slavery, Jim Crow laws, and segregation. And in 1932, the Federal Housing Administration developed a homeowner's loan practice known as redlining. They asked 46 cities in the United States to create these maps, and you're looking at one right now of the greater Seattle area. These maps were split up into zones based on the most hazardous, which are the red zones, to the most desirable, which are the green zones. And Black homeowners were steered away from the best and most desirable neighborhoods. They were also denied loans in the most desirable neighborhoods, as well as some other neighborhoods. And it was called redlining because the most hazardous and least desirable neighborhoods were in red. This practice continued formally until 1975. So it was literally a policy that was put in place for banks and real estate agents. It was not abolished until 1975 with the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. And it continues today informally. And this is why we see so much segregation in neighborhoods in cities. We're still seeing the fruits of this. Okay. Well, one of the fruits that we see is what we call today environmental racism, which is a term that's been around for about 20 years, although the outcomes have been around a lot longer. And so here again is Seattle, another map of Seattle. And as you can see, currently still the highest concentration of people of color is still in those places that were red zones before. And the highest concentration of environmental toxicity is also in those areas. In fact, the #1 factor that's associated with whether or not a neighborhood is going to have 3 or more environmental toxins in it is the race, the percentage of Black people living in that neighborhood or Hispanic people living in that neighborhood. And these polluters can be things like waste incinerators, chemical factories, toxic waste facilities are often clustered in neighborhoods that are predominantly Black or predominantly Latino. So we can see that the system has operated to advantage white individuals. The history of redlining has allowed them to be in neighborhoods that are the most desirable. If you know anything about Seattle, these have the best views, they're along the water, and they're the cleanest. And it has disadvantaged or oppressed Black individuals into neighborhoods that are less healthy and have public health, high public health risks for people living in those neighborhoods. Okay, if you have questions while I'm talking, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. So feel free to ask questions while we're going, and I'll try to answer them at the end. Okay, so our next example really comes out, it's connected to residential segregation. It is what we call the wealth gap. And hopefully you can see the right hand of your screen. If not, you should maybe move the pictures of the people talking away from there. But this is the wealth gap. And what this map is showing is the median family wealth, and wealth includes property, assets, the ability to home ownership, savings accounts. And the median is the number at which 50% of white families are above that number and 50% are below that number. So this map is showing that for white families, the median amount of wealth is $171,000 in savings, in home ownership, in car ownership, 10 times more than the median Black family's wealth, which is only at $17,000, which means that 50% of Black families actually have less than that in terms of wealth. And so this is really the legacy of Jim Crow laws and slavery, which denied Black families and Black individuals educational opportunities and employment opportunities. And then in the future, it shows a lot of differential outcomes for the future. The lack of ability to save for college, for example, or pay for college, the increase in college debt for Black families because of not having the generational wealth. So again, this is a really good example of where white privilege is generational. Okay, our last example has to do with the healthcare field. And in this image, you're looking at Dr. Marion Sims, who's considered the father of gynecology. He was the former president of the American Medical Association. He and many white doctors went to the South and performed many gynecological surgeries and developed tools through experiments on Black slave women without their knowledge, without their consent. Even worse, they did it without anesthesia because they were under the cultural belief, the dominant racial ethnic system belief that Black people did not feel pain. And so the field of gynecology is based on these experiments. We developed so many, they developed so many instruments. Even C-sections were performed on these women without their consent and without anesthesia. So Black women were dehumanized and their bodies were used and abused for the benefit of white women and other women who to this day benefit from those historical practices. Is this over? Well, not exactly. We do have a lot of outcomes from this historical racial abuse in the healthcare field. There's been a legacy of that belief that Black women don't feel pain or Black people don't feel pain. Current research in the field shows that when Black women are in labor, their pain is considered less severe than their white counterparts. Research also shows that doctors and nurses are attend less to Black women in labor than their white counterparts. That's been measured. And so what is one of the outcomes of that? There is an enormous health disparity between Black and white women in terms of maternal mortality. So this column over here on the right, 2011 column, says that of all the pregnancy-related deaths, 43% of them are Black women and only 12% are white women. Yet in the population, Black women make up 13% of the population and white women make up 60%. So all things being equal, that's the percentage we should see in the deaths. Instead, Black women are 3 times as likely than their white counterparts to die in pregnancy-related deaths. And we can trace some of this back to the cultural norms of the Marion Sims era, as well as the current research showing the differential treatment for Black women and white women. So that's a lot of stats, that's a lot of information. Let's just take a pause with your notes. If you want to ask some questions in the chat, you can, but take a moment just to think about right now, how has this information presented helped you so far to identify some of your own biases, to know how to pray better about the sin of racism, and to better understand the systemic aspect of racism and white privilege in your community? Maybe you can take a picture of those questions and ask them to yourself later, and maybe journal and talk to some other people in your community. We're going to move on here. So I could talk about many, many, many more examples, and in future webinars, we will do that about institutional racism in healthcare and in education and around COVID-19 and in the legal system and in public policy, home ownership, interviewing, and most especially the differential mortality rates due to COVID-19. But we're going just to summarize to say that the effects of racism and white privilege do add up. And we can see that the system overall oppresses Black people in particular. And here are just some of the things that occur for Black individuals, and it advantages white people. And here are just some of a few things that come out of this particular lecture on how they're advantaged. Having said that, we still need to just face one more thing today. The system of white privilege has led us to this moment in history. We have to face the painful legacy of lynching and the loss of Black lives. 4,000 people were lynched Black people were lynched between 1882 and 1968. And those are only the ones that we know of. Just think about 1968. I was born in 1968. Some of you were alive in 1968. People were being lynched during your lifetime. Many of them were lynched for perceived infractions like walking behind a white woman or attempting to quit a job or reporting a crime. So George Floyd was just the tip of the iceberg on top of a long, long history of lynching and Black lives lost in America. Black Lives Matter more, and that's why we're here today. So where do we go from here? Well, we want to someday in our next webinar give you policies and practices where you live, work, and worship to help you make change at the institutional level. Today, we're going to focus on what you can do at the individual level, and I'm going to hand it over to Katie, who's going to walk us through some of these changes that you can make on the individual level.
Thanks, JoAnn. So I want to talk about 3 different tools and 3 different steps. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is really just a start, especially for beginners to start thinking about what are some different things that I can do, what are some different steps that I can take to begin learning more, to begin reflecting more, to begin figuring out what actions may make sense. And so the first one here is to develop color consciousness. Revelation 7:9 is an important verse, I think, as we talk about this, because it really represents, again, God's plan and what his vision is at the end, right? So from the very beginning in Genesis, it talks about God created every person in his image. And then in Revelation 7:9, there's this image that John shares about, you know, at the end of it all, when everyone is standing before the throne, he's talking about how there's people from every nation and tribe and tongue standing together, right? And that's what God wanted. That's what that's his vision for us as humanity, and he celebrates that. And if God celebrates it and God sees race, that also means that we can acknowledge that we see race too. And I think, again, as we go back to these conversations, and what makes them difficult sometimes is that, at least for white people, it's been difficult historically for white people to acknowledge that they see race in different ways. And there are a few different ways that plays out. So one is around colorblind, and one is around the idea of color celebrate. So most folks have probably heard about the term colorblind. Really, the idea of that is the intention is to say, well, I treat everyone equally. I don't want to treat people differently based on their color. I don't see color, right? Therefore, I am free of racism. Right? I don't have racism in me because I treat everyone equally. I don't see color. And then the other side of that is color celebrate, which is really the idea of, oh, but I have a Black friend. I have a Black grandbaby. I work with Black people. Black people live in my neighborhood, right? It's this idea of like proximity. And since I can be in close proximity and I have relationships with Black people and other people of color, therefore I am free of racism, right? And so the unfortunate thing with both of these things, and where it's problematic, is that both of them tend to take race off the table. It takes the conversation off the table in a way. The intent is to share, well, I'm okay, right? Like I don't want to have these behaviors or these tendencies, right? But really what it does is that it just takes it off the table and it denies that it exists. And so the first step is really start to developing that color consciousness, right? And there are a few different ways you can do that. The first is just to learn, to dive in. And this is where I think it's important to highlight Black voices and other people of color that have devoted their lives to this work. Again, the tendency might be to sort of go to that friend to educate you. So rather than going to that Black friend to educate you, I would encourage you to look to these Black voices. And we'll have a slide that shares some of those resources, people that have devoted their life to this work to learn more, right? Along with that, as you begin to learn, is acknowledging that these injustices are happening. You'll start to notice them more. You'll start to learn how these pieces and these institutions sort of actually fit together and impact each other. And then that last piece is building empathy. I think when JoAnn gave that example of the mask, I had a similar experience, right? Where when for COVID, I started wearing a mask and going into The grocery store, the only thing I was concerned about was like not getting COVID, and it was my health. I wasn't concerned about getting kicked out of the store or being viewed as dangerous or a criminal. I wasn't concerned, like some Asian or Asian American people have shared, that they're going to be harassed, that they're going to be like said that they started this all, right? I have the privilege of not even thinking about that, right? So as we learn these things, we begin to build empathy and start putting ourselves in other people's shoes more. So again, that's that first step of developing color consciousness. The second step is around self-reflexivity. So if you want to go to the next slide, JoAnn, self-reflexivity is really this idea of not just reflecting on ourselves, but also thinking about how the system, right, how the environment that we live in has influenced us, and also how we are influencing that system, right? Just like what JoAnn talked about. And I think 2 Corinthians 7:9-11 is a really good reference to this, about as we begin to really reflect back and really think about our role in all this. It talks about this idea of godly sorrow, that when you have godly sorrow, it's not something that you regret, but it actually leads to repentance, and that leads to salvation, right? And so I think the more that we can pray in that process, and also really starting to like ask those hard questions and really reflect on how you've been shaped by racism and how it's still manifesting in your life, both at that individual level on a daily basis, but also on that systemic level. Because the question is not if you've been impacted, it's really how. Because again, we live in this system, and so we're all impacted by this. It doesn't matter the color of your skin. It doesn't matter, you know, how much good you've done. It doesn't matter how much you love God. These things are all impacting us. This is a system that we live in. And then the other piece of that is to find people to process with. And so thinking about who are, again, for white people in particular, finding other white people that you can maybe have an accountability partner with, or a cohort or a group that you can join, so that again, as these emotions coming up, as you're learning, you're committing to that together to work through those things and to process those things together. That the last piece is around figuring out how to take action, right? And not just action, being intentional about anti-racist actions that we want to take. Ibram Kendi is a pretty well-known author. I saw somebody post in the chat at the very beginning of this, like, I just want to learn where it started, right? He has a great book called Stamped from the Beginning. It's pretty thick. It's a heavy lift and a heavy read. So informational though. He does really, really great work. And one of the things that he shares in that book, a quote that he has, is that racial progress is always followed by racist progress. And so it's not just, as we're talking about justice, it's not just one path, it's not just one way, right? And so this is where it's really important to not just learn and not just reflect and not just do a book club, but really think about, as James 2 talks about, how do we really start acting on our faith? How do we start demonstrating our faith by our actions? Because the reality is that this is not just a process where you sort of learn and you evolve and then you fix it, right? One thing that comes to mind, like one illustration that really shows this racial progress and racist progress, is really the example when I think about that in the church on Sunday morning, it's like the most segregated time of the week, right? You all have probably heard that. If you haven't, right, when people go to church on Sunday morning, that's when they deem to be the most segregated time of the week. And Martin Luther King Jr. talked about that in 1960. That was 60 years ago, that he had the same conversation, right? And so when you think about it, it's not just sort of these actions that we're taking, right? There's also a spiritual component to that. I really think that Satan's intention is to divide. It's pretty clear that the hope is division, right? To keep people separated from the church. And I think that's a demonstration. And I'm not saying that that's sort of the ultimate goal, that everyone will have one church, right? I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that that is an illustration of when you think about, yeah, I think some people prayed in the 60s, and I think some people showed up in the 60s. But when I think about this moment, I'm really wondering how people are going to show up now. And I appreciate that you all came to this, and I hope it doesn't stop at this. I hope this is just a start for you, right? To really figure out, how do we really start to move this forward so that 60 years from now, when your kids or when your grandkids or when your great grandkids look back and they say, and they look at the history books and they're like, wow, how did the church show up, right, in this moment? Because I think we're going to have that conversation 60 years from now. I would really hope that we can say it's not the same conversation, right, that it looks different. And in order to get there, I think we really need to start figuring out, how do we pray with our hands and our feet too, right? And how do we demonstrate that? And so some simple ideas to get started, again, as a beginner to this, is learning a lot and absorbing as much information as you can. And in the next slide, we'll show a little bit about that. Starting to show up to different things, starting to attend events like this, right? Inviting friends, starting to have conversations. Committing to those conversations with a white accountability group, right? Pairing up with people, maybe a group, maybe a cohort. Those don't have to be formal necessarily, but just finding somebody to start working through these conversations with. Learning to start interrupting those microaggressions, those daily slights that, one, we do ourselves intentionally, but that other people might do, that we might be able to address in some way. And then again, continuing to learn more. Like one example is Juneteenth. So today is June 18th. Tomorrow is Juneteenth. If you don't know what that is, I would encourage you to Google it and read a little bit about it. And then once you read about it and realize the significance and the importance of it in our American history, I want you to ask yourself the question, why did I know about that before? Like how did I manage not to learn that in the past? And again, that goes back to self-reflexivity, of really starting to reflect on, I didn't even realize some of these things were happening. I didn't even realize these parts of my history, right? And then going back and doing that reflection work and learning more and taking action, and going back and doing that reflection work and learning more and taking action. And so that's that process and that cadence that we go through. So JoAnn, if you want to go to the next slide. We're gonna send out this recording to folks. You could also take a screenshot or take a picture on your phone if you want to see these resources. But these are some different people to read, things to watch, folks to listen to, people to follow. And I want to start to wrap up this conversation. And I want you to think about, as we move forward, you showed up today and I really appreciate that, right? And that's great. And a lot of people are starting to have this conversation. What's one more thing that you can do in like the next 3 days before the end of the weekend? Like what's one more action that you think you can commit to and be willing to take around this? And I want you to think about that and think of a specific action, because in a moment I'm going to have people post it in the chat that they're willing to commit to. So I want you to think about that. Is it maybe starting to follow Be the Bridge on Facebook? Is it having a conversation with somebody about something you learned during this webinar and say like, hey, I'm really working through this. Like, this is something I've learned. I don't know what to do with that yet, but it's something I want to learn more about. Maybe you Google Juneteenth, right? Maybe you look up other events that you can attend. Maybe you choose to buy one of these books, right? And then order it so that you can read it soon. What's one thing that you can do in the next few days to continue on, to keep the conversation going, to move forward? So in a moment, I want you to start typing it. You don't have to hit send yet, but in a moment, I'd like you to put that in the chat. And I want to read some of those out before we wrap up today. So just think about it. What's one thing? It doesn't have to be a big deal. It can be a small 5-minute thing, it can be something more significant. But what's one more thing that you can do? So I want to encourage everyone to write that out, and if you're willing to, post it in the chat, and we're going to read some of these out. Looks like somebody posted about Juneteenth, joining Be the Bridge Facebook group, starting a small group about the color of compromise. That's one of the book clubs that Run is about to start. If you're interested in that, I have an email address in a little bit that you can send an email to and get connected to it. Watching Just Mercy, right? That's free right now on Prime. That's really great. It's an amazing book and an amazing movie. Brian Stevenson does great work. Learn more about Juneteenth. Subscribing to the Scene on Radio podcast, that really good podcast. I would highly recommend that. Finishing White Rage and watch Just Mercy. Lots of these are coming through now, right? Again, I think this also shows that like individual actions can make a difference and they're very important, but also when we come together as a body and start taking collective actions and we all start contributing, I think that's when things really start to move, right? That's when you really start to build momentum as a movement. So again, I wanna really encourage you and challenge you, just do one more thing this week, right? So I appreciate you sharing that. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And I want to share a little bit, if you do want to get connected to the Racial Unity Network, you can join our Facebook group if you aren't a part of it already. So you can just search Racial Unity Network on Facebook and join. If you're interested in being a part of a book club, then you can reach out to Curtis Price. He's the one that started this webinar, and his email is up there. If you want to join our listserv to be updated about things that are happening, you can also email him and he can get you connected to that. Or if you have any other questions. So at this point, Eric, will you stop the recording and then we'll go ahead and transition into Q&A, please.